Welcome, everybody. This is Credibility 3, our third credibility panel that we have at the Sochika conference. And I'm very happy to be the chair of this panel. We're still waiting for the participants to arrive, and while we are waiting, let me introduce you the formal circumstances or give you some brief introduction to the formal stuff. Unfortunately, I will have to leave at 2 o'clock. So, but Camilo from the Sochika team is so friendly to take over at 2 o'clock. Camilo is the one who was doing the Italian case study and is an international lawyer, of course. And Camilo will be your chair from 2 o'clock on. Yeah, what else? Yeah, as usual, we have too many participants to take questions directly. So questions will be handled through Q&A. Please feel free to ask your questions already while people are presenting. I will collect them. And in the end, we will have discussion, and hopefully as many questions as possible will be answered and discussed. Yes, what else? That's basically it. We have quite a lot of participants meanwhile. So, okay. Then I will start with introducing the panel now. Welcome again. I'm very happy to be here with you. I'm very happy to be your chair. Credibility 3 is a panel where all the panelists will present research they have done in the last few months and years on credibility. And they found some striking similarities and decided to present this together. And I'm really looking forward to hear about it. Who is the panel? We have Leila. So just a second. Sorry. This is my computer now. So. I'm sorry, my computer is not very cooperative right now. Now it is, here we go. So on the panel, we have Leila. She is the executive director of the UK Lesbian and Gay Immigration Group. The group has been supporting LGBTQI+ people through the asylum and immigration system since 1993. They provide psychosocial support, legal advice and information, and advocate for changes in government policy and practice. Before joining the group, Leila worked in international development and advocated for the rights of LGBTQI+ people globally. Leila came to the UK as a part of a refugee family when she was 13 months old. We have Sabine from the Netherlands. She was the main researcher of the Fleeing Homophobia report, and she was involved in the gay asylum cases XYZ and ABC at the European Court of Justice. In 2018, her report, Pride or Shamed, was published, a research on LGBTI asylum practice in the Netherlands on behalf of COC. We have Andrea, who is a PhD candidate at the University of Bergen in Norway. Her project focuses on the right to refugee status on the basis of sexual orientation. She has previously looked at how the Norwegian immigration authorities assess the credibility of a reported sexual orientation. And this analysis builds on a case review of 187 asylum decisions made in the period between 2010 and 2015. And finally, we have Aino, of course. Aino has worked as RFSL's asylum lawyer and is a public counsel specialized in LGBTIQ+ asylum seekers for about 8 years. In 2012, they wrote a thesis about the Swedish asylum authorities' assessment of sexual orientation as grounds for refugee status. At the time, gender identity was completely missed and misinterpreted as homosexual orientation, which was one of the main conclusions. For 2 years now, Aino have been working on a research report, which our FSL will be published by our FSL in August. It examines the criteria in Swedish case law and the credibility assessments of sexual orientation, gender identity, and gender expression as grounds for asylum. It is based on over 1,500 individual asylum decisions from the Migration Agency and Migration Court rulings. So these are our panelists. What is going to happen now? We are going to have 2 rounds of presentations. The first round, the panelists will present their research to you. No, first we start, sorry, my mistake. First we start with Sabine. And Sabine is going to give a brief introduction to the issue. And then we're going to have our first round where every researcher is presenting their findings. And then we have a second round where together the whole panel presents their ideas and expectations for the future. So we start with introduction by Sabine. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Petra. No.
Now I hear you.
No, I don't think so. Okay. Since a few years, in many refugee receiving countries, the main reason to reject LGBTI asylum claims is that the applicant's sexual orientation is not believed. After other obstacles were largely overcome, and as a result, asylum policies in several countries became more LGBTI friendly, asylum authorities started to fear false claims from straight people. And therefore the focus shifted to disbelief, and this led to many rejections based on incredibility of the sexual orientation. For instance, in the Netherlands, I found 85% of rejected LGBTI claims were rejected for this reason. In the ABC judgment, the EU Court of Justice provided guidance regarding the impossible task to assess the credibility of a stated sexual orientation and ruled that explicit questions on sexual practices are not allowed, nor porn, nor decisions based solely on stereotypes, for these would violate the right to dignity and the right to privacy. In this panel, we have representatives from 4 European countries. Sweden, Norway, the United Kingdom, and the Netherlands. All of us have researched LGBTI asylum policy and practice in our countries, and we found striking similarities. All 4 asylum authorities put an excessive focus on narratives of self-realization, expect an internal struggle, an emotional journey, feelings of shame, processes of awareness and self-acceptance, and the discovery of clear sexual identities. Whereas talking about sex can easily lead to disbelief. We have the impression that models and frameworks which are based on presumed universal characteristics of sexual identities in reality consist of new stereotypes. Regarding the DISH model, originally drafted as an alternative to the explicit questions on sexual acts that have now been forbidden by the Luxembourg Court, it seems to us that this type of model has contributed to move practices and policies too far in the opposite direction, and that it places too much focus on the emotions and the psyche of the applicant. Now the floor goes to...
The floor goes right to Leila now, and I would please ask you to present your main conclusions and findings.
Thank you very much. In 2018, UK LGIG published a research report called Still Falling Short. Our research was into the standard of decision-making in LGBTQI+ asylum claims by the UK's Home Office. We examined about, well, more than 40 cases where the applicant had been refused asylum. And the majority of the cases that we looked at were claims based on sexual orientation. The report picked out a number of themes that came out from these many cases, And one theme that emerged was a focus on narratives of self-realization. So I'm going to summarize for you the findings of that research in terms of the narratives of self-realization, which has its own chapter in the report, and that can be found on the UK LGIG website. And I will reiterate, this is about sexual orientation in particular. Now, our report found that the UK had moved away from a focus on sexual behaviour, which we welcomed. However, there was now an excessive focus in practice on emotions and articulating a narrative of how your identity developed. This is not prescribed in the written guidance that the Home Office has for its caseworkers, interviewers, and decision makers. But the guidance does focus on exploring the development of sexual orientation. And in practice, this is translated into an expectation of a journey associated with a linear development of sexual identity. This would appear to us, and the findings in our report is a stereotype and is not applicable across cultures. Not everybody will have gone through introspective soul searching and retrospective interpretation of their experiences. Not everybody would have had an experience of their sexual orientation, which includes an emotive narrative or where emotions are central. We found that in interviews, the Home Office was asking questions about feelings at multiple points during the interview. There were also questions about emotions pertaining to an early age in the applicant's life. For example, asking a woman in her 50s how she felt when she was a teenager. There was also expectations in the materials that we examined that the applicant would experience an inner conflict and use emotive language, and that this was a compulsory element of self-realization. For some people, they found this quite confusing in their interviews, as the questioning around feelings was understood to be in relation to physical feelings rather than emotions or thoughts. It was also problematic in the cases of some women who do not experience same-sex attraction or same-sex relationships until adulthood. And there were examples of women whose claims had been refused because of that. I'm going to just read out some examples from the reasons for refusal letters, which I think will bring to life the issues that I have just raised. So, for example, there's a letter in the report which contained the extract. It's considered that your inability to provide information about emotional development of your sexuality is inconsistent with your claim. There was also a sentence in a reason for refusal letters saying that the applicant had not demonstrated any journey of thought or emotion regarding their sexuality. Another very similar quote was that the applicant had failed to provide an account of their emotional journey of discovery. In another case, there was a letter which stated that they did not consider it reasonable that the claimant would be unable to clearly describe their journey from their first realization through to a full acceptance of their sexuality. I'll continue. There was another quote which said that while it is accepted that a young adolescent may struggle to verbalize these feelings, it is not considered plausible with the benefit of age you are unable to identify any thoughts or feelings you experienced at this time, and the time being referred to was when the individual was around 11 or 12 years old. I carry on again, another quote. It is reasonable to expect you would have had a lot of pressure and mental ordeals to overcome in realizing your sexual identity. Another one, it is reasonable to expect an account of emotional struggle and confusion. And in the same letter, it was found that the applicant's account was wholly lacking in compelling detail or any emotive terminology. My final quote is that despite knowing such relationships were not socially acceptable in your country of origin, you make no mention of having felt anything other than good. And these are all given as reasons for why somebody's sexual orientation was not believed. Thank you.
Thank you, Leila. We go on with Andrea right away.
Yes, thank you for the introduction, Petra. As mentioned, I've researched how the Norwegian immigration authorities understand and define sexual orientation, as well as who are considered to be a credible sexual minority asylum seeker in Norwegian practice. And I've looked at 187 asylum decisions, and all of these concerned sexual orientation, so not gender identity or intersex conditions. Now in Norway, there has been a very similar development to the one that Leila describes for the UK. And this has really started with there being a shift in the focus of sexual orientation from focusing on this as a type of behavior to an identity. And as in many other countries, this has sort of culminated with the rejection of the previous requirement that sexual minorities should conceal themselves in order to avoid persecution in their countries of origin. Now, in Norway, this occurred in 2012, and following this, the Norwegian immigration authorities gave a new definition of sexual orientation, where sexual orientation was defined as an identity. Now, while this is positive in that it stops the reduction of sexual orientation into being a matter of behavior, it doesn't really answer the question of what other elements immigration authorities expect to be present in order for a reported sexual orientation to be credible. And that is what I've tried to focus on examining in my case study. So a first finding of the case review is that according to the practice of the Norwegian immigration authorities, it is not sufficient for asylum seekers to substantiate that they have engaged in same-sex relationships or acts. As an example, in some of the decisions that I looked at, the immigration authorities accepted that asylum seekers had previously been in same-sex relationships or had engaged in same-sex sexual acts, but it was found that the reason for doing so was convenience, obtaining physical pleasure, or gaining access to other types of benefits, such as economic gains. So previous and current same-sex sexual practice was only held to be credible or relevant to the assessment if the asylum seeker could show that it was motivated by emotions, romantic feelings, and sexual attraction. And in addition to this, none of the claimants I mentioned were held to be at risk of being perceived as sexual minorities in their home countries, despite their sexual practice, because seeing as these sexual acts were not motivated by their inner identity, they could be expected from refraining from that type of behavior in the future. The case review also showed that decision makers in Norway are very careful not to ask asylum seekers invasive questions about their sexuality or sexual practice. However, the decisions also indicated that the avoidance of focusing on sexual acts went further, and that claimants who voluntarily focused on sexual experiences in their explanations were generally treated suspiciously by decision makers. And in the internal notes to one decision, I even saw mention that the caseworker had heard that asylum seekers who focus on sexual acts are often not credible. So instead, similarly to what Leila describes, what I found is that in Norwegian decisions, the immigration authorities operate with an expectation that a credible sexual minority asylum seeker should have undergone what they call a process of self-realization concerning the development and understanding of their sexuality, and they should be able to provide reflections about this process in the asylum interview. And in practice, this entailed describing the discovery of their sexual orientation in a staged and linear way, starting with initial confusion and feelings of being different and culminating in the asylum seeker realizing and settling in a clear sexual minority identity. And these assumptions, as many of the panelists have and probably will mention, are problematic because they are based on the idea that a person's sexual orientation constitutes a fixed and immutable characteristic, and that there is a normal way that sexual orientation is developed and experienced. And moreover, in terms of what the process of self-realization should entail, the case review indicated the same type of topics as Leila mentioned in the UK practice, in that it was held that discovering their sexual orientation should lead to feelings of being different. It should lead to shame, fear, and stigma, and all of these negative emotions. And in this respect, the Norwegian approach to assessing sexual orientation seemed to focus on criteria that are also mentioned in the so-called DISH model that was mentioned in the introduction. But this model is not explicitly mentioned in any public guidelines or decisions. So I can't say specifically that they are employing this method, but it's definitely clear that similar sort of topics are being put forward. And conversely, applicants who talked about being happy when they discovered their sexual orientation or when they met their same-sex partner were often held to be to lack credibility because they could not say anything more aside from the fact that they felt happy about this. So I don't have a lot of time, but I think this gives a brief introduction to what I found in the Norwegian material. And I also think it is worth noting that the Norwegian immigration authorities have tried to underline that they have focused on finding ways to make good credibility assessments that do not violate any of the asylum seekers' rights. And I would say that they seem to have been quite successful in eliminating more old and traditional stereotypes about how gay people look or act. But at the same time, there seems to be a movement towards a new form of stereotypes that builds on very Western understandings of sexuality that focus on identities and emotions. So I think I'll stop there and pass the word on.
Thank you, Andrea. That was really insightful. Our next presenter is Sabine, and I hand over.
Hi, thank you. In the Netherlands, the same concepts are being used in assessing credibility of sexual orientation as in the United Kingdom and in Norway. The main problem brought to light by my study, Pride or Shame, is the expectation that LGBTIs always go through a process of awareness and a process of self-acceptance. They are supposed to have struggled with feelings of shame, guilt, and insecurity before they could accept themselves. However, it appears from the examined files that the occurrence of these processes is not in line with the experiences many asylum seekers have. Often they do not understand what these questions on processes are all about. And in fact, they are often glad to find out about their sexual orientation. Their problems are not caused by inner struggles, but by the hostile environment. Therefore, the expectation that LGBTI asylum seekers must have gone through psychological processes before they could accept their sexual orientation can be qualified as a stereotypical point of view. I'll give you two examples. To a man from Asia, who I, in my report, called Thomas, the IND, the Dutch Immigration Naturalization Service, said that no, on the man, he said he has not gone through an acceptance process, which is surprising now that homosexual acts have been criminalized in his country of origin. One may expect that he would have had fear of being cast out, of not being accepted, fear of the future, and fear of his life. None of this has become apparent. It appears from his statements that he did not have any doubts. From a person in this kind of situation, one would expect that he can speak at length, convincingly and clearly about the emotions he had experienced. A progressive line should be discernible in this. Of someone who is actually gay, one would expect that he can indicate which emotions he experienced, since this has a profound effect in somebody's personal life. In this respect, the person concerned is not convincing. And to a man from Africa, could not make it plausible that he, a Christian boy who grew up in an environment where homosexuality was taboo and forbidden, embraced his sexual orientation without any scruples. He was asked several times to explain this process, but he has failed to do so. And now I will pass the word to Aino, please.
So, Aino.
Yes, am I being seen? I can't see.
I can hear you.
Yes.
We're still waiting for the picture of Aino.
I don't know whether it is me who can. Yeah, I have to start video.
Oh, here you are. Perfect.
Yes, I'm
So
seeing that. Good.
the floor is totally yours.
Thank you. I'm going to time myself. So I have been working on this research that is hopefully going to be published in August or a bit later, but it's based on approximately, or it's going to be more than 1,500 individual asylum decisions and also court rulings between the years 2012 up to this very date, and I keep adding cases still. And the cases are sexual orientation, gender identity, gender expression, which is actually an independent ground in Sweden, which is recognized separate from sexual orientation and gender identity. And also these ascribed identities. So that is what the research is based on. And my findings are that there are specific, very clearly stated requirements or criteria in the Swedish case law today by the Swedish Migration Agency and also the migration courts. And this is within the credibility assessment. And the first very clear criteria or requirement is that the applicant must have undergone an inner emotional journey of self-realization of the sexual orientation, gender identity, and or also the gender expression. The second clear requirement is that the applicant is able to describe and give a very, very detailed verbal account before obviously state officials, a lawyer and the interpreter present. And this account has to be, like I said, very, very detailed, and it has to describe thoughts, feelings, and reflections within this expected emotional journey leading to the expected realization. The third requirement that is very clearly written in the refusal motivations is that the applicant has experienced or at least can relate to and reflect upon feelings, negative feelings of difference, stigma, and shame within this expected emotional journey. And the fourth requirement is that the more stigmatized and taboo LGBTIQ are in the country of origin, the more the applicant is expected to have felt, thought, and reflected about their own LGBTIQ plus identity, and therefore the more detailed their verbal account has to be about that emotional journey, which is required. So the migration agency and the migration courts write very specifically in the refusal motivations that it is reasonable to demand of you that an inner emotional journey has taken place. They write that it can be demanded by someone claiming SOGI asylum claims that they have experienced feelings of difference, stigma, and shame. And this is systematical within all of these decisions and rulings and decisions that I have examined. And I forgot to say, but I also work myself as a public counsel, so I sit in with these interviews and hear the questions being asked on top of also then reading the 1,500 plus rulings and decisions. And I forgot to now time myself, but I have a few more minutes, I think 2 or something. The problems I can identify is with this excessive focus on the inner, the emotional, is that, for example, sexual orientation in Sweden and in by Swedish migration authorities is defined as something strictly emotional, and they see it as, they write actually that it is about identity and it is exclusively something emotional. So this leads to that applicants whose same-sex relationships are believed, they can be in a same-sex marriage, they are believed about the marriage, they are believed to be cohabitating with a person of the same sex that they are partners with, but it doesn't mean that they are gay or bisexual. if you cannot account for an inner emotional journey, you are not believed, and therefore you are denied, even though the court or migration agency do believe that you are in a same-sex relationship. And I see this leading to discretion reasoning, because you are then denied and you can go back to hiding your same-sex relationships because you didn't account for a verbal, give a verbal account for an inner journey. So to me, I see a discretion reasoning based on this excessive focus on the inner emotions. The other thing is that Sweden applies these criteria on gender identity and gender expression and also perceived SOGI claims. And trans, especially trans, non-binary and intersex, for example, my own clients, many of them, they don't have these experiences. They haven't gone through a deep inner emotional process, and many of their asylum claims and the persecution that they fear is linked to something physical, and therefore an emotional journey is not, it's not always there, and it shouldn't be required from them. And unfortunately, there is also that Sweden is going backwards. We have gone backwards, I would say, almost a decade, to a point where there is now a mix-up between sexual orientation, gender identity, and gender expression. For example, I see trans women being tried as and assessed as homosexual men. They get questions about sexual orientation, and they will be denied because they have not been able to account for an emotional journey about their sexual orientation, or even in some cases transsexual orientation. I've seen that word be used in several refusal decisions. And for the same reason, also gender expression as an asylum ground is also systematically being rejected, because people cannot, they don't have the expected experiences. I think I can stop there. I think I've used up my 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Aino. Okay, we already have some questions, but we have another second round, and maybe some of your questions will already be answered by this second round. Alba, would you be so kind, Alba, our facilitator, to change into the other mode? Okay. Anyhow. Everybody's back, that's good. So the second round now will be about findings, expectations on conclusions of the whole panel, and the running order will be the other way around. So I give the floor back to Aino and asking to please present your findings, conclusions, and thoughts.
Yes, well, where I left my presentation a bit, my thinking and my conclusion is that it is very, first of all, I have to say that the migration agency is very open about applying the DSSH model, whereas the courts, they don't refer directly to the model, but they do refer to the Supreme Court. They have a ruling from 2013 where they picked out one single sentence from the UNHCR guidelines, and it is that very sentence that refers to stigma, shame, and harm and difference. So they picked out only that sentence, and this is now what the courts refer to. So therefore, I can see that the courts also indirectly use the DSSH model, or they at least they refer to that one sentence in the guidelines. But the main, like Andrea also said before, the main thing here is that this seems to have become a new stereotype, and it is a fact that not all of us LGBTIQ++ people across the globe have universally common experiences and characteristics. And my argument is that this expectation, and in Swedish case law, the strict criteria that you must have gone through and be able to verbally account for an inner emotional journey that on top of that also has to have specific feelings and emotions and thoughts and so on. It is not realistic, and it is a stereotype, and it's very based on the Western somehow assumption that all of us have. You go from point E of confusion and psychologically feeling not well, and then to point B, which is a fixed identity that it is immutable. And I think that asylum authorities have to find a way to listen to different stories and finding them credible. There are always going to be different descriptions and different experiences, and therefore the stories are always going to vary. And another thing is that we are actually failing to live up to an individual assessment, at least in Sweden. It's not an individual assessment when you have these forehand criteria that you apply to every asylum seeker. Just one last thing also, that at least in Sweden, this excessive focus on the inner and what experiences the asylum seeker must have has led to that all other evidence is just disregarded. All letters, statements by partners, NGOs, evidence of the person being active in LGBTIQ activist work in the country of origin, it is all disregarded. Unless you have a story about an emotional journey, that is all that matters today. So from my perspective in Sweden, I would wish that the asylum authorities could also take into account other type of evidence in support of the verbal account. Thank you.
Okay. Next speaker is Sabine.
Yeah. Okay. On the question how to assess sexual orientation, I think the best answer is self-identification. For it's the only real possibility. But in any case, I think we should avoid the expectations of inner struggles or other stereotypical ideas on the development of sexual identity of LGBTI asylum seekers. Although I think in the Netherlands, the DISH model is not applied as such, the similarities we found make me think the ideas behind the model might have entered Dutch policy and practice through a back door. I'm afraid the DISH model reinforces the stereotypes we try to get rid of. The idea that all or most asylum seekers have experienced an internal struggle, an emotional journey, or a process of self-acceptance. I therefore think it might be better not to use these kind of models anymore. Of course, we should not return to explicit questions on sexual acts, but I think we should not rely on models that are based on stereotypes either. Furthermore, as long as we do not make a choice for self-identification, I think it's good to listen carefully to the story of the asylum seeker. We should, of course, also take into account statements of third parties, like partners or friends. Officials should be trained in recognizing stereotypes, and we should take the benefit of the doubt more seriously. And to add, which is a question already, whether we should maybe take the cultural background of the asylum seeker also into account, whether this could help to avoid stereotypes. I think yes, and this is because the Dutch Council of State recently issued a judgment in which an asylum seeker from Uganda won his case because the Dutch Secretary of State didn't pay attention to a report on LGBTs in Uganda, and especially not to the part of the report which was specifically on his case. And I think it's good, it's important, but the other thing is that this asylum seeker got rejected once again after this judgment. Anyway, this I should stick to my story. I give the floor to Andrea.
Andrea?
There we are, sorry.
Yeah.
Yes, thank you. I can begin by saying that I definitely agree with the other panelists who have made good suggestions. And I think this part of the panel will perhaps be a bit depressing for those of us who are lawyers or jurists and who like clear definition and good answers. But I do think that is one of the most important things to take away from this, that we need to stop looking for a script. We need to stop thinking that we can find a final answer that will put the credibility issue to rest. And in that sense, I agree with Sabine that the best thing would be self-identification, while at the same time realizing that the way we built this system today makes that an impossibility. But then as a minimum, we should realize that self-identification is the clearest way of establishing sexual orientation. It should be the clear starting point. And we need to have approaches that doesn't assume that if you do not conform to a specific script, then you are not credible. And in regards to that, I also think there is takeaway from the jurisprudence of the Court of Justice of the European Union, who has recently said in a judgment that it's not always necessary to even consider credibility. For example, where you can establish that the person in question will be perceived as a sexual minority. And I find that important also to underline, because I think this very strong focus on the inner essence of the claimant also means that behavior, as Aino mentioned, has become completely irrelevant. And I do think, like, for the decision makers to listen to what kind of behavior or life the claimant is living, and what kind of risk that exposes that person to, also in being perceived as a sexual minority, is very important to recognize. Yeah, and I clearly also think that claimants should be able to talk about their sexual practice, both because that may be the way they experience their sexuality, and also because it can be very difficult to separate emotions and narratives from sexual behavior. So I think that is the main things I want to say right now, or I want to say a lot more, but should give the floor to someone else as well.
Next one is Leila, yes.
Thank you. Yeah, I've been typing away to try and capture the points that my fellow panelists have said that I agree with. So there's a bit of repetition, but it's just to pick out the statements that I find most pertinent. One is the fact that LGBTQI plus people around the planet, there's 7 billion people on this planet. That's a lot of LGBTQI plus people amongst that 7 billion, and not everybody will have common experiences or characteristics, whether you're fleeing persecution or not. And also, I do believe that the cultural background has to be taken into account. You have to listen to the individual story and use that as your starting point. I don't believe that any model can be universally applied to anybody. So I would not advocate for starting at any particular point as the default, because it can lead to an entrenched way of thinking. If you start with one particular route of questioning or one particular point of analysis, it can mean that anybody who doesn't fit then becomes, their credibility starts to be questioned. Yeah, I do agree with the point as well that the focus on the inner sometimes means that the evidence from other sources or other types of evidence can be overlooked. So, you know, whether it's about your relationships, for example, or witness testimony from others who know the applicant. So the applicant may not describe themselves in emotive terms or give a story of their life in a way that the decision maker expects, but they may have somebody who knows them very well who can provide that. And there's a risk that evidence like that gets overlooked. And I think I would just mention also that I think it's important not to apply models across asylum claims as well. I don't think you can have any one model for an LGBTQI plus asylum claim, and I think equally you can't have the same model being applied to claims based on other grounds in the in the Geneva Convention, including other applications based on belonging to a particular social group.
Thank you very much to the panel for your really insightful presentations.